This coupled with potentially less access and the slower rollout of the coronavirus vaccine programs in places like India, does this set us up for a pretty bifurcated state of recovery in Asia?
I believe it does. The recovery in Asia is still pretty much entrenched. I'm very confident of that we will see a recovery in 2021. However, it's going to be very uneven across the board. It's going to very much depend on how these recent resurgence in cases in countries like not only in India, but also in Philippines, and we're starting to see a fourth wave in South Korea. Really important to see how these things play out. And we also know that the vaccine rollout has been quite slow in emerging economies, as you mentioned, and particularly in some parts of Asia as well. So I think that potentially has the prospect of delaying some of the opening up, and hence resulting in a slightly slower recovery than we had initially anticipated.
What about the risk of a more hawkish than expected Fed if, Chair Powell is right and we are at an inflection point for growth and potentially inflation going forward? Is there also just a double whammy that some of these Asian EMs are going to have to cope with rising rates and the pressure on their currencies as well?
This is a big risk going forward, that if we get a situation where the US economy significantly outperforms and is in a position where the Fed could contemplate normalizing, whereas Asia is still severely lagging behind, then yes, that would be a huge major headwind if that were to occur. However, that's not my baseline case. I am still of the view that the Fed will be very patient, and that will allow not only the US economy, but I guess the global economy as well, to come some way towards full normalization before they contemplate lifting rates.
Just to add to Heidi's point, we actually saw the Korean won leading the declines in the previous session, given that we saw those PPI numbers out of China. We do have a Bank of Korea decision this week. What are they facing in terms of economic challenges?
The Korean economy is actually recovering quite well, driven by the export sector, and the export numbers have been very impressive. However, the domestic economy is still somewhat weak. The labor market hasn't fully recovered, and yet at the same time, the Bank of Korea is also worried about asset prices, particularly in housing. So it's actually quite a challenging mix. I think for the Bank of Korea, the safest path is basically to do nothing, to leave rates as it is. After all, we are also facing, as I mentioned earlier, a potential fourth wave of virus outbreaks. So it's still challenging for policymakers, but at least from an economic standpoint, the recovery is very much entrenched. However, it is primarily driven by the export sector. It hasn't really broadened out into the other sectors at this stage.
Exactly. Export sectors perhaps led by Samsung and their semiconductors. This GTV chart on the Bloomberg showing its huge weight when it comes on the Kospi, their valuation of Samsung, valuation of the Kospi rising. So what's the broader outlook for the South Korean market, South Korean assets, the Korean won, when the recovery seems to be so narrowly focused?
It is narrowly focused at this stage, but ironically, it is because of the narrow focus of it that I believe asset prices in Korea could actually continue to do quite well. Because of the tech-heavy nature of the Kospi, for example, and as long as those sectors continue to do well, we will see a return of portfolio inflows into Korea, which will be very supportive for the Korean won, which is why we've seen in recent times the won has actually started to strengthen, as has the Kospi, and asset prices also includes housing, which has been moving up. So this very uneven nature of the recovery, which is reflected also in asset prices, is an ongoing challenge for policymakers in South Korea.
Is that the same narrative that we're seeing perhaps in China as well, with those tech giants really seeing the upside during the pandemic? What are we seeing in terms of the broader economy?
Well, in China, it's slightly different because they have managed to contain the pandemic very, very well for quite a long time now. And the vaccine rollout is starting to progress. And I think the Chinese authorities have a goal to at least having a majority of the population vaccinated towards the end of the year. So we're actually already starting to see Chinese economic recovery broadening out into domestic demand. which is quite different from what we're seeing in other countries where it's still lagging behind. And I think the one important difference between China and some of the other economies in the region is around tourism. China is not reliant at all on international tourism, whereas in Asia, countries like Thailand and Singapore are. So as long as borders remain shut, those economies that are dependent on tourism will not see a full-blown recovery, whereas for China, that doesn't really matter as much for them.